Welcome to FourSight U. Today, we are lucky enough to have Gerard Puccio with us, and he is going to be talking about preferences at work and the implication of in thinking preferences for person-job fit. And before he gets started, I want to make sure that anyone who doesn't exactly know Gerard's pedigree will know it before we get involved. Gerard, known to me as Gerard, known to many as Dr. Puccio, known to his students as Dr. P, is the author of the FourSight assessment. He's the author of numerous other books, articles, and research studies as well in the field of creativity and creative problem solving. He's also the director of the Center for Applied Imagination at Buffalo State University, which is part of the State University of New York, where he had recently earned the honorific title of Distinguished Professor, which is a coveted thing to get. So congratulations for that. We are lucky enough that he's also conducted and or supported most of the research studies that have been done on FourSight, including the one he's going to be talking about today. I remember sitting around the dining room table when we were just starting work on FourSight, the company, and talking about what we wanted it to do. And the phrase that rose above others was, we wanted it to democratize creativity. And I remember all of us thinking there was so much amazing research and knowledge about these theories and these practices that it would be our greatest hope to bring that to the world and bring that to everybody. So I am delighted to hand this over to Dr. P. Gerard.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Well, great to see so many familiar faces and names. Looking forward to sharing some of the most recent research out of FourSight. And of course, I'm not just representing myself in sharing this with you, but the illustrious team at FourSight, Sarah, Blair, Greg, and Russ, because if it weren't for the team, we wouldn't be in this position to have what is if you will, a learning laboratory of data that allows us to go in and test out the theory and to expand our work. And as Sarah so nicely said, to help to democratize creativity, in other words, to help people to reconnect with their creativity and to allow it to flourish. So thanks to the FourSight team for making this happen. So I'm gonna, the real reason, and Sarah didn't mention this, the real reason why students call me Dr. P, they tell me at first it's because they stumble over my last name, Puccio. But I think the real reason why they call me Dr. P is that I am one who uses PowerPoint, I won't say as a crutch, but as a framework for keeping me focused. So I think that's the real reason why they call me Dr. P. So I'm going to share my screen, and with that, a PowerPoint deck that we will be happy to make available to folks if you wish in the future. So we're talking about FourSight preferences at work, looking specifically at implications that this might have for person-job fit. And I will say to you that I hope we have a bit of dialogue around this, because I will share with you the outcomes in response to or thinking about two specific research questions. I can tell you what we found that was statistically significant, but then drawing meaning out of that is sort of up to us in terms of, this is what the data says, but what does that mean? What are the implications to this? What's the value in understanding this or seeing these results? And that's where, Sarah, however you wish to facilitate this, I don't mind if people jump in, or if they post questions, maybe that's the best thing to do in the chat box. And if you wish to interrupt me, feel free to hit the Dr. P pause button and fire in a question or an observation. So let me start by saying, when the insight to FourSight, which is not always what we call this theory and measure, but when the insight came to me, I thought, oh, we'd have this little measure that helps people to identify their creative thinking preferences, but where the research has gone has really exceeded my initial expectations. And I think in part I was being a bit naive, because when you think about the fundamental role creativity plays in all of our lives, and you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, and you look over the arc of human history, and you look at how our species, for better or worse, has used applied imagination to adapt to changing environments, and in fact used our applied imagination to modify the environments through what we create, and then that then forces us to quickly adapt in this vicious or virtuous cycle. When you think about creativity in those terms, or at least when I do, I'm not surprised where FourSight research has gone. So FourSight, while it exposes, as Sarah pointed out, it democratizes creativity by helping all to understand that creativity is inside of you, that it is part of your natural human makeup, and that it plays a crucial role in all of our lives if we think about it in terms of everyday versus special talent creativity, but everyday creativity. To see where the tool has gone in terms of revealing things, it shouldn't be a surprise. So thinking about how FourSight in research with Blair Miller and Selçuk Acar has helped to identify how profiles of leaders change as you move up the organizational hierarchy. Looking at the relationship between FourSight and states of well-being research done with Pam Zalay, Amber Boyer, and Selçuk Acar. Looking at the recent research study done with Dr. Nagma Khan, an emergency room doctor in Atlanta, looking at ER doctors and burnout, and seeing that FourSight, when compared to job characteristics like the number of hours spent at work, the number of years in career, FourSight mindset thinking preferences was a stronger predictor than job characteristics of burnout. I shouldn't be surprised, because it reinforces the power of the theory, and not to pin it to FourSight, but really how FourSight as a tool helps to reveal to us something that is fundamental to our experience in life. And as Alex Osborne said in his radio address on This I Believe radio program with Edward R. Murrow, creative effort leads to a good life. And so it really is just so core to our experiences. So now in this session, we're talking about gaining some insights into how creative thinking preferences, these mindsets, play a role in the workplace. One of the benefits of having gray hair is it means you've been around for a while. And now, having been in the field for 40 years and at the Center for Applied Imagination for 33 years, looking at the arc of my own experience in terms of how we talk about creativity, there's never been a better time, in fact, to talk about creativity, because there was a time 30 some years ago, or even going further back in conversation with B. Parnes, who said, when the word creativity was used on campus, it was a dirty word. It was a word you ran away from, or a word that when invoked, you had to be prepared to defend yourself. And that's not the case anymore. In one generation, we've gone from creativity being a dirty word to the World Economic Forum, as you can see in this slide, looking at the top 10 skills for success in the workplace in 2025. The fifth most important skill in the lower left-hand column is creativity. Fifth most important skill. We couldn't so openly talk about creativity 30 years ago. Yet you have these kinds of reports coming out regularly, and I've got many that all point to the same thing, because of the pace of change, mainly driven by technology. We live in a volatile, increasingly complex, chaotic world, and it's hard to predict what the future will be. So creativity is now a crucial workplace skill. I would also argue, if you look at this list, there are creativity-related skills sprinkled throughout. Creativity doesn't appear once. I would say it appears at least 5, 6 times in this list, which reinforces what I had shared earlier about the universal quality of creativity. So FourSight is just one lens into this, but it opens up so much for us. And so thinking about this, creativity in the workplace, how might FourSight help us to understand and get a view to how the creative mindset plays out at work? And so fortunately, thanks to the team at FourSight, we have this very large data set of 60,000 respondents who voluntarily completed demographic measure anonymously that allows us to query the data set and develop deeper insights into the theory and to help us expand the theory. So one question that people complete when they volunteer to participate in our research is a very simple question: how well suited are you for your work? And there's 4 responses there: not well suited, somewhat well suited, and very well suited. Now, I will tell you, the numbers here are not evenly distributed. Far fewer people indicate that they're not well suited. So in our analysis, we had to combine not well suited with some well suited and compared those 3 response sets. So not well suited along with some well suited as one response set, well suited and very well suited. And I should also acknowledge someone else, a statistician at the University of Central Florida, Shiva Jahani, who did all the number crunching around this. So a special shout out to Shiva. So what we found, and I'm not going to give you the statistical output, I'm going to show you graphs because I find that most people prefer visuals when they're trying to understand data. So this is the clarifier preference mapped onto 3 response sets: those who said not well suited and somewhat well suited, and very well suited. And if you look at this, you see a very clear progression from not well suited to well suited to very well suited. You see increasing preferences, very clear increasing preferences for the high clarifying tendency. Now, I will tell you, you're going to see this for all 4 scales. It's going to be the exact same pattern. So what this indicates is when people, and this is self-report, and of course there's limitations with self-report, when people are asked how well suited they are for work, they're much more likely to say they're inclined to feel they're very well suited when they also have a high preference, significantly high preference for clarifying. All right, let me get rid of this. And let me show you what it looks like for ideator. Oh, gosh, almost the exact same pattern where, again, those who are very well suited or say they're very well suited, again, self-perception, this is subjective, not objective, who say they're very well suited, have dramatically higher preferences for the ideator mindset. Guess what? Exact same profile for developer and the exact same pattern for implementer, or pretty similar. So across all 4 preferences for scales, not surprisingly, World Economic Forum got it right. People who say they have a lot of energy for creative problem solving, creative thinking in all 4 areas: high clarifying, high ideating, high implementing, high developing, and high implementing, also say they're well suited for work. And so in some ways, my sense for what this means is, again, given the VUCA world, this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous space that we work in, And this, in some ways, also corresponds with a very interesting research study done by Ronnie Reeder-Pahlman during the pandemic that found that individuals who self-report stronger abilities or capabilities in creative problem solving also report being less thrown by or stressed by the COVID pandemic, and report faring better during the COVID pandemic. And so I think this sort of goes along with that research, in that those who say they're most well suited have high preferences for all areas of the creative problem solving process or the creative mindset. So again, to me, that indicates and reinforces what LinkedIn says, what the World Economic Forum says, what the P21 Collaborative says, which is being a flexible, imaginative, creative thinker is necessary in today's workplace. And so this, I believe, corresponds with those comments. Now, let me move on to the next question. So it looks as though having a creative mindset, whether it's clarifying, ideating, developing, implementing, and probably high energy in all four areas, helps one to feel more confident. There's this notion of creative self-efficacy, right? Which seems to be it's growing in not popularity, but it's gaining valence in the research community, that creative self-efficacy, creative confidence. If you've read that book, it's a very similar concept, that this does correlate with creative performance and creative behavior. And so this seems, again, to reinforce that research. Now, let's click into and double click, if you will, on how the FourSight preferences specifically show up at work. So we've got 15 different occupations. When individuals complete this demographic measure, there's 15 specific occupations that they can choose from to indicate, here's currently where I work within my career. Now, earlier research with Dr. Blair Miller and Dr. Selçuk Acar has been published and has looked at the question of how do these preferences show up at work, but with a much smaller data set. We're now looking at 60,000 participants, and we did an analysis where we measured statistically significant differences within the set, what stands out as high or low within each of the four scales. So again, going to visuals, here's a graph of the 15 occupations. So if you look along the horizontal line here, you'll see the 15 occupations. So we have finance, quality, operations, marketing, consulting, advertising, design, IT, engineering, R&D, sales, human resources, communication, purchasing, professional services, and customer relations. Now, there's a lot to look at there, so I'm going to focus in, draw your eye in on a couple key points. So in looking at this analysis, we get a statistically significant, what's called F ratio, which says there's some differences among these groups. They're not all the same. Some have higher or lower preferences. So we do what's called a post hoc analysis. That's where we compare every group against every group to identify what really stands out as being different. And so when it comes to high clarifying, IT, so IT, which is here, IT showed significantly higher preference for clarifying in comparison to 10 other occupations. Wow, that's pretty dramatic. So those who work in information technology are much more likely to say they have a high clarifying mindset than 10 other occupations in this set. Customer relations followed closely behind that. In customer relations, they showed a high clarifying preference, statistically significantly high clarifying preference compared to 8 occupations. Engineering showed higher clarifying preferences compared to 6 other occupations. And then finance, quality, and purchasing showed significantly higher clarifying preferences compared to 5 other occupations. So what starts to emerge from this is you kind of get a sense for the mindset, if you will, within occupations, and they're not all the same. So while the earlier analysis showed that being well suited, high preferences for each of the 4 scales correlates with the response or the self-perception, subjective perception that you feel well suited for work. But when you go into specific occupations, vocational psychology, person job fit, this may show that people with different preferences are attracted to and stay in different occupations. So we're seeing, while the World Economic Forum might say creativity is important in all workplaces, that there are different mindsets that are showing up in these occupations. In terms of low preference, there was one that stood out that you see I have circled here. Those who indicated that they work in the field of communication had a significantly lower preference for high clarifying when compared to the remaining 15, all other 15 occupations. So again, there's something going on here that says, again, this is not a pejorative. When we say low, that's not a pejorative comment. That's just low energy, right? A low preference. People who have a low preference for low preference for clarifying, the people who go into communication have a significantly lower preference for clarifying when compared to all other remaining, within our set, 15 occupations. So different profile emerges, different graphic. If you find it useful, I think for me, highlighting a few of these for you. Now, this is looking at the ideator mindset, and you're going to see different occupations, of course, come forward here. So we've got 3 in particular that show up that through the post hoc analysis, this pairwise comparison. Advertising, design, and R&D. So advertising, design, and R&D showed significantly higher ideator preferences than 11 other occupations. So again, we only measure 15, or we allow people to select from among 15 different occupations. And we find in advertising, design, and R&D, they show significantly higher ideator preferences. And you can imagine, you think about these occupations versus the high clarifying occupations, how they might pull on. There's a different cognitive demand, if you will, within these occupations that align with the ideator mindset. Again, this post hoc analysis also showed low preferences. Again, let me emphasize, this is not pejorative. This is a preference. It's a mindset. And it's really fascinating, interesting to see what low ideator preference occupations there are. And here, finance, again, we're talking about the ideator scale here, shows significantly lower ideate preference when compared to 10 other occupations. And operations showed significantly lower ideate preferences when compared to seven other occupations. So the question that then follows up, well, why would that be? Is there a lack of space? To what degree is the environment shaping the thinking? Where in these particular occupations, that is a virtue, that having a low idea, and Sarah's really good at always describing this, that it's not a negative thing to have a low preference, that in fact, in these occupations, maybe it is beneficial to have a low preference for ideating in finance and operations. There's something about those environments that make that an appropriate and good fit.
Gerard, can I just ask a quick question from Liz Monroe Cook? You know, you've circled finance and operations. Is quality also one and just not circled, or?
No, it's not. It's not. The quality, I think this is due to the fact that there's a low sample size in quality. So we don't have a large enough sample size to say with confidence that it's significantly different from the others. And thanks for pointing that out. Liz, I had the exact same question that I posed to Shiva, and that was the response that I got back from her. So we're more confident where we have a larger sample size, and that's why you're going to see that repeated as we go through when it comes to quality. So let's look at developer scale. Again, we see, I mean, just looking at the pattern, you see this wave, right? So we have some occupations where there are high preferences, and then you see the valley associated with communication. Looking at, again, post hoc analysis, what occupations really stand out as being different from others. This is kind of like Sesame Street. Which one of these is not like the others? So for those of you bringing it back to your youth. So again, we find IT. IT was significantly higher in the developer mindset when compared to 11 other occupations. And let me again stress, this is 11 out of 15, not counting itself. So it's really one compared against the other 14. Customer relations showed a higher proclivity towards developer when compared to 8 other occupations. And then a smaller number, but still, I think, pretty interesting. Engineering, significantly higher developer mindset compared to 6 other occupations, and purchasing when compared to 5 other occupations. And here, again, communication stands out when compared to all other 15. Sorry, I'm misquoting. There's a total of 16 occupations, unless I miscounted. Communication showed a significantly lower, again, let me emphasize, not pejorative, lower preference on developing when compared to all other remaining occupations. And then finally, the implementer, again, looking at the visual, you can see some real shifts in moving up or down in terms of the implementer preference. Here, there are 3 that I'll highlight, and I'll highlight them all at the same time on one graph. When it comes to high implementer preferences, sales, interestingly, sales shows up when compared to 11 other occupations, a high implementer tendency. Operations showed a significantly high implementer tendency when compared to 5 other occupations. And engineering, in terms of low implementer preference, showed a significant difference when compared to 4 other occupations. So if you want to kind of see it all together, this is a kind of a highlighting what I just went over in summary. So top slab here are the high preferences across clarify, ideate, develop, and implement. The bottom row is the low preference occupations in each of these 4 areas. And I find this fascinating because we see, and this is theoretically, I think, something that highlights the richness and the variability in creative mindset as we move from one environment, work environment, psychological environment, or cognitive environment. As we move from one to another, we see these changes, we see these differences.
Gerard,
and so
a couple of questions come up. One is, does the analysis show a difference in preference when an individual is working with public or private sector? This is from Mary Brown.
Yeah, we have not looked at that.
Okay.
So in terms of,
okay.
Yeah, no, in terms of this data set, but Sarah, as you may recall, with the organizational level data, we did look at private sector versus public sector, and we found the same pattern in the analysis, just a little sharper. The slope was sharper in the private sector than it was in the public sector, especially when it came to moving from tactical level leadership to senior leadership, where the slope for ideator was more dramatic in the private sector than it was in the public sector.
And 2 more questions. One is from Harry Vardis. Who are the people who make up communications, and if they are low in all four dimensions, what makes them happy?
That's a great question. Who are they? Well, I don't know for sure. This is where I can just tell you the individuals, when presented with the 16 occupations and they choose the one that best fits them, they're choosing that label communication. So I don't know specifically what fields they're in, private, public. I just know they happen to be choosing among the 16 occupations. That's the one that fits best for them. In terms of what makes them happy, Harry, that's a great question. You know what? Ice cream used to make me really happy until I learned that it caused inflammation. But now it less so, makes me less happy. That's the limitation of the fact that, you know, people are complicated, and FourSight just looks at these four dimensions. I want to just jump back through the slide deck and look at where communication. So communication, you can see it's a low plot point for clarify. And for ideate, it moves up a bit. It's sort of not quite as low as others, but certainly not a peak preference. When we look at develop, again, clarifying and developing are very analytical preferences. You see a similar result for communication relative to developer. And let's just see where it is for implement. So sort of middling, not high, or a low preference. So that's a great question, Harry. Love to follow up with some people in communication and find out what makes them happy. D, I think you worked in communication. I don't know if you raised your hand because you want to jump in.
It's completely anecdotal, completely speculation. But yeah, having worked in communication and the people that I know, the work can a lot, depending on what you do in communication. You're not so much creating information as you are aggregating it. So you're, in a lot of the communications people that I know, they're just taking other people's work and putting it together and then aggregating it and putting it out. So you can get away with not having those preferences, I think. And then completely anecdotal, you have just described my husband who is in communications. Okay. So yeah, it made me smile through the whole presentation as you were showing the graphs.
Okay.
Just
cool.
a guess.
Cool. Okay. Suzanne, looks like you have your digital hand up as well. Follow up?
Well, I can speak to that too. I was thinking that there is room in communications, which is a fairly broad term, for each one of those preferences. And if you're talking about someone who puts an event together, yeah, you've got an ideator, and development sure helps. And then you've got a media relations. It's a whole other thing pushing that release out. You've got implementation. I mean, there are specific pieces. I think it covers all of them. And I think people ultimately find their niche. And I think that is when you get happy in communications.
Yeah. Well, and these are very broad categories, and you could go into subdisciplines, right? Like, are all engineers the same?
Excuse
Probably
me?
not. Probably not.
Right.
So this is coming into the main conversation about creativity. As you go in and you look at specialties, I suspect with a greater granularity, you might find that this is too general. So these are overall patterns that we're looking at in terms of people making choices, but let's not paint everyone with the same brush.
Yes.
So we can open it up in a second. Let me just conclude and then open up the conversation, because this is where it's rich for me. So this is a robust data set. It's no small data set, 60,000 people in it. One case, at least with quality, this was a couple hundred, I think, people who identified themselves working in the area of quality, but in all other occupations, we had several thousand or more. So it's a pretty robust data set that we're looking at. And I think this has interesting implications. So if you ask me for my opinion, I think this has interesting implications for what in psychology is called person-job fit. And so thinking about where FourSight and more broadly, thinking about the creative mindset and its implications for how we choose our jobs, because person-job fit in theory predicts satisfaction at work, predicts stress level at work, predicts burnout at work, predicts performance at work, with the broad assumption that the better we fit with our job, the more satisfied we'll feel, the greater the performance will be, the lower the degree of potential of burnout is, just speaking theoretically in terms of what person-job fit is about. Now, when you talk about person-job fit, that can break broadly into two buckets, if you will. One is, how do your individual capabilities match the job responsibilities? So if you need to keyboard 100 words a minute and you can keyboard 10 words a minute, that's probably not a good match, right? Performance is going to suffer. It'll probably be very stressful. So that's what's meant by capabilities matching job responsibilities. Now, what intrigues me is the other kind of person-job fit, which revolves more around psychological differences, where personal thinking preferences align with the cognitive demands of work. So the work that we do, the space that we're in, the environment that we're in, the tasks that we're engaged in will place certain cognitive demands on us. And how do our thinking preferences match those demands? So for example, we saw finance had high clarifying tendencies. So what are the benefits of someone who decides to go into finance who has a high clarifying preference? We might assume, to be discovered, that those individuals with a high clarifying preference in finance would perform well, would feel more satisfied with their career choice, might feel less likely to suffer from burnout. I'm hypothesizing here. Or if we look at the ideating mindset and those who are attracted to advertising, does that match between your personal thinking preference and the kind of demands of work lead to certain positive benefits? Could say the same thing for low preferences as well. So a low preference for ideate and you're an engineer, does that have certain benefits to it as well? And again, when we say low, it's not a pejorative label, but more of an observation in terms of energy. So with that, I think, Mark, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I do. Thanks. So super interesting presentation. I've been waiting for this for a while, and unfortunately, I'm going to miss a little bit because I have to go in a sec. But so what you're describing so I guess we're not yet at person-job fit, right? So what we're done is kind of like who goes into a profession, perhaps, or who stays there, but we still haven't said this person is good and this is what their profile looks like. So that's kind of a next step sort of thing. Is that what I'm?
That's
cool.
Exactly right. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
sort of teeing up the implications. Yeah. And that, Mark, you're helping us because we have a partner meeting coming up and we're talking about expanding the demographic form to then maybe look at things like, well, how satisfied are you with the choice that you made in your career? And does this personal preference looking at occupation then allow us to make certain predictions? But you're exactly right. I'm hypothesizing.
Yeah. So, and if I can give a kind of practical, it's not really practical, it's from psychology example. So in leadership theory, there's leadership emergence and compared to leadership efficacy. And so, for example, people who are extroverted tend to become leaders, are much more likely to become leaders than people who are introverted, but the evidence shows that that both introverts and extroverts are equally likely to be as good at leadership. So it's the difference between why you end up doing something as compared to how good are you as a result of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you're also underscoring what I think are the benefits of awareness and self-leadership. So it doesn't mean you can't do these things, right? But having the knowledge then allows you to circumvent or anticipate potential challenges and therefore be better and more facile at navigating those challenges. And I think your example of leadership in terms of extroversion, introversion is exactly right. Yeah. Cool.
I
Cool.
think
Thanks, Mark.
Gina might have her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I was curious whether you crunched it. Pardon me, no camera. I'm a little under the weather. I'm curious if you crunch these numbers along level lines as well as along job professional lines. So supervisors, mid-level leaders, senior leaders, C-suite, et cetera, if you had anything on that,
We did.
If you do, you said.
Yeah. Go ahead, Gene. I don't want to cut you off if you have a part B to that.
Well, and then I was also wondering if you then like disaggregated, so you were looking at both level and industry, but I'm most curious about the level piece.
Yeah. So what we found replicated, and I didn't go back and look at this. We did this analysis like 6 months ago. And I wanted to specifically focus on these two questions in terms of whether you feel well suited and what the implications are of that in terms of your FourSight preferences, and then looking across these occupations to see if there are different preferences that come to the fore. So level, and this is something that Sarah, I don't know if you you had the Miller, Akar, Puccio article, and I think people have access to that, or at least certified folks, or I think we maybe make those available, those published reports to everyone. So there is a published paper on that. What this analysis, going back 6 months and trying to remember, I'm fairly confident that it replicated the same findings that Miller, Ajar, and Puccio found earlier. Weird to reference myself in the third person. That it's the ideator mindset. When you look across 6 levels from non-management up to executive positions, and we split it 3 and 3, tactical level leadership and strategic level leadership, the preference that showed the most substantial gain. Now, this is not longitudinal. We didn't track people over time. It's just a single snapshot. But people in strategic level leadership positions reported having significantly higher ideating mindset. And that was found again, looking at this data set of 60,000.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Mary
Yeah.
Brown, is that really
Yes,
you?
it
Oh, it
is.
is. I recognize that smile.
Hi, Gerard. I do have a really quick couple of questions, actually. Firstly, thank you for sharing this data, because it seems to be replicating what I'm seeing just from a consultant's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Working previously predominantly in the private sector and then working more now in the public sector, there's a huge gulf. There's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so two of the sort of questions that I had, and I'm seeing this a lot in the public sector, and I don't know whether there's a difference, because in terms of your demographics, is it predominantly US based, or does it how is it broken out?
Yeah, it's predominantly US.
Yeah. But everything that you have said, regardless of that, I'm actually seeing in the UK, regardless of that anyway. With regards to the question about communications, it's interesting what I've seen in the public sector, in the sense that through legislation changes and so on and so forth, they are being used as vehicles to push the communication, so their creativity and everything else is stifled. They're just used as the vehicle to communicate on a wider scale.
That's interesting. So yeah, and then that you know, I can't tell you from the data whether that's true or not, but in looking, and this comes back to Harry's question, what makes them happy? Separate study looking at things like self-esteem and confidence that does correlate with FourSight. And if you're in a high pressure situation, you've been beaten up over time, maybe that's something that happens to people in communication, I don't know, that could suppress your scores. Don't know, interesting hunch, but you're also making me think an implication of this for those who work in organizations like you. I don't know if you ever feel this, but as you work with one functional area versus another functional area, you feel like you might be going from Earth to Jupiter. Like it just feels so different. I worked with a group of engineers. What was that book? Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. This is the same kind of thing. Engineers are from Mars and people in advertising are from Venus. You know, so you may feel, and this may give insight to those in those functional areas, why there can be conflict between those functional areas. It's not just about their job responsibilities, if you think in terms of the cycle of work and where they fall in the cycle of work, but there could also be what's contributing to that are individual differences that create friction and misunderstanding and so forth. And so I had never thought about that until you started talking about, oh yeah, Men Are From Mars and Women From Venus. There's a FourSight book in there somewhere.
That's what I'm seeing, because that's exactly what I'm seeing. And so the challenge is really pushing on collaboration for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, and then you couple that, Andrea and Jonathan, I see your hands are up. I don't want you to get tired. But that also corresponds with Dr. Ashley Goodwin's research when you ask people who they prefer to collaborate with. And Sarah can probably cite this better than me because it's been a while since I've looked at that research. Sarah, do you remember what Ashley's findings showed?
I think her findings lined up roughly like this, that people who like to clarify like to work with other people who like to clarify. And they can tolerate people who like to develop as well. And people who like to develop are very comfortable working with other people who like to develop, and they're okay with clarifiers as well. People who like to implement really only are happy working with other people who like to implement. Everyone else is just way too slow. And people who like to ideate tend to like to work with everyone, but not everybody likes to work with them. So that's where we land.
Yeah. So again, thinking about functional areas and these leanings, that might give some insight into who and how they prefer to collaborate with others. Andrea, great to see you, man. Sorry you had your hand up for so long. You got to come off of mute. There you go.
That's okay. Oh, it's great to be here with you all. Long time. So thank you for sharing. It was very interesting. And as a consultant in this field, I mean, it's really interesting to see all this stuff. And you made me curious about one thing. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now, what we saw are basically correlations that tell us that, for example, I'm a consultant, I'm an ideator, so it makes sense. Yeah, you show that consultants tend to be ideators. So
exactly.
That's me. What I cannot see in the data, and I'm not sure we can see that in the data, is whether I'm a consultant because I was born an ideator and therefore I went to the consulting. So the causation part, right?
Yeah.
Or did consulting made me an ideator as a coping mechanism, basically, right? So I think it'd be really great if we could delve into the data and understand, for example, checking demographics by age of tenure, and see whether young consultants have a stronger preference towards ideation or not. So if it's two ways, we would see a weaker connection, a weaker link between young people than
No, that's a great question. Now we can look at that. We didn't, but thank you. that's a real contribution, because what you're saying is you should find an equal number of the consulting. Thank you for picking up on that. I didn't mention that. That was the other of the 4 occupations that showed a tendency towards high preference for ideating. You could look and you'd expect the same pattern to hold across all ages, right? Which
That
would help to
would mean
support what
that
you're saying.
ideation leads to consulting. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so so I don't know the answer to that, but we can look at it as you're suggesting. When you look at person job fit, there's a theory called attraction, selection, and attrition. So certain people are attracted to certain occupations and selected by, don't forget, that's a two-way relationship.
Yep.
So you're attracted to, selected by, and if you don't fit, you get attrition, which then creates more homogeneity, right? So it would be interesting to see also who's leaving. Like the really interesting research study done on the KAI at the Naval College, Annapolis, looking at adapters and innovators. And 1 year after being admitted into the Naval Academy, they found that people who are high innovators tend to drop out of the Naval Academy. So, you know, would it be interesting then in consulting, you find, I don't know, high clarifiers drop out of consulting or move on to something else because of the cognitive demands aren't a good fit? I mean, that's really interesting questions. So, but thanks for the thought about age. We can look at that. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Gerard. If you've addressed this question already, I've sort of been in and out. So if you've addressed it, just tell me to listen to the recording. I'm curious, and this is a methodology question. When you look at the scores, it seems like you're looking at the numbers, the raw scores, rather than the peak preferences versus neutral versus low preferences.
Right.
And I'm curious why that is, because my understanding is, and what we always tell people is, look at the shape of the graph, not the numbers. And so aren't the numbers relative to oneself within an individual profile?
Yeah, so we use the scale scores from a statistical analysis because that allows us to use the full range versus a frequency count of number of high preferences, neutral preferences, or low preferences. Yeah, I mean, just from a statistical perspective, we can use more powerful stats rather than putting them into categorical data, which is what you're talking about, right? High, moderate, or low. It would be interesting to go in and look at frequencies in terms of high, middle, or low, but statistically, that's why we use the full scale, because it gives us more powerful statistics to use.
Okay.
Did you just? Oh, you took your hand.
No, I was just thinking about that. I mean, yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Sure. Well, and I think you can translate it too, because when we start talking about significant differences, for example, when we're looking at clarifying, and we see finance has significantly higher tendencies towards clarifying when compared to other occupations, you can translate that into, that would predict you're going to find a greater number of high clarifiers in finance, for example, just to build the translation in there, if that helps.
Gerard, I know Ken is up, but there's a question from Megan Mazzina that sort of segues directly from what you just said, which was, does this mean we should use FourSight as a hiring tool?
No, not as a hiring tool, but it can be useful in giving people insight and information about themselves. And also, I think perhaps where better used is within functional areas to say, let's look at our profile. Here are our tendencies. Let's think about the kind of person that would be a good fit. Because my worry would be if you narrowed it down to a single number, there's so much more about a person that you're missing. But through the interview process, you can make some assessment about all the other qualities, skills, or abilities you want someone to have, but also think about their fit, in terms of cognitive demand with that particular job or occupation. That's my recommendation.
And I would second that, as, you know, from the perspective of the FourSight company, we really don't intend for FourSight to be used as a hiring tool, but more as a developmental tool. I mean, I think of our son, Cole, who has a preference to ideate and became an engineer. And he would have been dissuaded from becoming an engineer if you just looked at it on the basis of his FourSight preferences, but he just did land a job at NASA where he's just become a design engineer. So he landed within a category he doesn't fit. He landed in a job where he does.
Well, and I remember when you and Blair coached him before going to RIT, that here's your preference, recognize this about engineers, you are going to find these potential challenges in terms of the cognitive demands. If I remember you retelling that story to me in terms of working with Cole, and also encouraging him to find ways to exercise his IDA preference, which he did by taking courses in entrepreneurship and innovation. And so he was able to feed that. So, yeah. Should we, do we have time
Ken
for
is the
chat?
last one up.
Yeah, I saw Ken had his hand up for a while there. He must be exhausted.
I'm never last. Dr. Hey, fascinating research here, and the, like, for operations in military, we see high implementation. Jonathan can attest to that also. I'm certified in KI. Know you started off with some of that too. You know, they also have a level of the KI in regards to teacher, military, etc. And we're seeing within the work that Jonathan and John Cobber and I are doing with Joint Special Ops University, a correlation. I know in the original research, the DISC, the KI, and the FourSight assessment, there's a correlation between those two. And I think what we're seeing is tracking with what your research shows in regards to operations, etc., and the FourSight assessment. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, of course. Good to see you as always, Ken.
Well, I think our time has technically run out. So I want to close by thanking you, Gerard, for sharing this remarkable body of research and your really first crack at this data set of much bigger numbers than we've ever used to look at this career information. So this is really new and is really exciting, and it'll be really neat to see where you go with it. I love the questions that people asked.
Yeah.
But I'll turn it over to you for a close.
Well, no, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate the level of engagement. So many familiar faces and names. Just lovely to see everyone. And thanks for the input. You've challenged me to think further about this. And that's what I love about this community. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have any follow-up questions.